Most people today step on acorns without even looking down. They rake them into piles, bag them as yard waste, and forget them. But if we shift our perspective from the 21st century back to the early 14th, that same small nut suddenly becomes a historical actor. For a medieval peasant caught in Europe's Great Famine, an acorn was not clutter underfoot. It was an argument with death. The crisis that set the stage for this transformation began in 1315. Chroniclers describe a sky that would not close. Heavy rain fell across much of northern Europe in spring and simply refused to stop. Fields turned into shallow lakes. Grain rotted, standing in the mud. Even when seed germinated, it often failed to ripen before the next wave of storms. Medieval farmers, whose livelihoods depended on a fragile ratio of seed planted to seed harvested, saw that ratio collapse. In good years, 1 grain of seed might return 7. Now, at best, 1 grain planted produced 1 grain back. 1 to eat, none to spare. The weather was only one half of a twin catastrophe. Between 1315 and roughly 1319, a mysterious cattle plague spread from east to west, wiping out an estimated 60–80% of European herds. In England and Wales alone, more than 3/5 of cattle vanished within a single year. This meant far more than the disappearance of beef. Milk, cheese, butter, and leather, the entire protein and material economy that ordinary people relied on, collapsed. The famine, already brutal because of crop failure, became worse because animal power and animal products were suddenly gone. Contemporary accounts strain to describe what this looked like on the ground. We read of a king, Edward II of England, unable to find bread in one of the richest abbeys of his realm. We read of people eating horses and dogs, and of acts that the chroniclers hint at but refuse to name explicitly. Alongside hunger, there was a fraying of social order. Theft, violence, and desperation surged as the usual moral constraints broke under the pressure of empty stomachs. In this environment, the forest ceased to be a backdrop and became a lifeline. Where the plowed fields failed, the oak woods still produced a crop, one they had produced for tens of thousands of years: acorns. To modern eyes, acorns are incidental. To medieval peasants in the famine years, they were one of the few reliable sources of calories left. It is no exaggeration to say that in some regions, the forest became the last functioning supermarket when the agricultural economy crashed. Yet, medieval people understood something we often forget. This apparent gift of the forest came with a hidden price. Raw acorns are not benign. They are heavily armed with tannins, bitter polyphenols that give red wine its dryness and strong tea its astringency. In the concentrations found in many acorn species, these compounds are more than unpleasant. They can interfere with protein absorption and, in large doses, damage internal organs. Simply, eating handfuls of raw acorns to fill the stomach would have been a quick route not to survival, but to illness. This paradox, abundance that is simultaneously dangerous, is what gives acorns their dark history in the video's framing. They embody the kind of resource that can only be turned into food through knowledge. And here we slip from the drama of famine into the quieter drama of technique. The central question is no longer, is there anything left to eat, but rather, how do you transform a toxic nut into safe nourishment, using nothing more than water, fire, stone, and time? Archaeology confirms that this was not an improvisation invented in 1315. Sites dating back roughly 7,000 years contain ceramic vessels lined with acorn starch granules. At Iron Age settlements, burned granaries have been found filled not with grain, but with stored acorns. These are not the traces of occasional desperation. They are evidence of systematic, year-round processing and storage. For many communities, long before and long after the Great Famine, Acorns served as a planned winter reserve, an integral part of the subsistence strategy, not a last resort. Written sources fill in the picture. Greek and Roman authors mention acorns being ground into flour when cereals ran short. Medieval chroniclers in Italy and elsewhere describe peasants stealing acorns from pigs to bake into bread, often stretching the acorn meal with millet or barley to make something barely sufficient but just enough to carry them through. The medieval term forest famine itself, used when even oak trees failed to produce, shows how deeply people had come to rely on this woodland harvest. To lose the acorn crop was, in their eyes, the worst imaginable scenario, the famine beyond all famines. In other words, by the early 14th century, Europe had a long memory of acorns as both salvation and hardship. When the Great Famine hit, people already knew that the woods could feed them, but only if they were willing to invest enormous labor and apply techniques refined over thousands of years. The video's story of roasting acorns, like medieval peasants did, is not just a quirky historical reenactment. It is a doorway into a technological tradition that stretches back to prehistory and reaches its most dramatic moral intensity under the pressure of 1315-1322. Seen from a historian's vantage point, this first movement of the narrative accomplishes something important. It reframes acorns from background scenery into a central character in the drama of survival. It also introduces the theme that will run through every subsequent step of the process. The idea that survival in the Middle Ages was not a matter of luck, but of painstaking embodied knowledge about plants, weather, soil, animals, and the chemistry of food. Acorns crystallize that insight in one small, bitter, deceptively simple shell. When a medieval peasant walked into the woods, they didn't see trees. They saw a map of survival. The forest was a living supermarket that opened for only a few weeks each year, and every decision inside it could mean the difference between a full winter and a silent one. The first rule of this unwritten science was knowing your oaks. White oaks were the quiet heroes of the forest. Low tannins, sweeter acorns, far easier to turn into food. Red oaks were the villains, loaded with bitterness so powerful it could wreck your stomach if you didn't process them correctly. But medieval peasants could read the forest the way we read a phone screen. Leaf shape, bark texture, even the shine of an acorn cap told them instantly what they were dealing with. No hesitation, no guesswork. Their knowledge wasn't academic, it was survival-level instinct. Autumn hit like a starting gun. As acorns rained down, animals surged forward in the same race. Squirrels, jays, deer, wild boars. Humans weren't dominating nature. They were competing with it. Entire villages flooded into the woods in frantic harvest sprints before the first frost arrived, or the animals claimed everything. If you've ever imagined medieval life as slow and peaceful, acorn season would shock you. It was chaos with purpose. But gathering wasn't enough. Every acorn had to pass 3 brutal tests. No caps, those nuts were immature. No cracks, mold travels fast, and one bad nut can ruin a winter's supply. And absolutely no tiny round holes, the mark of the acorn weevil, the insect that eats a nut from the inside and leaves behind nothing but a hollow shell. A single mistake meant hours of wasted labor in a world where no one could afford waste. And then came the final exam, the float test. A wooden trough filled with water, a splash of acorns, and nature revealed everything. The good ones sank. The bad ones floated like tiny confessions of failure. This simple trick, shared across medieval Europe and indigenous America, saved families more times than we will ever know. When the sorting was done, the chosen acorns were spread out near the hearth to dry. Their shells cracked more easily after days in the warm air. Their moisture faded. Their bitterness began to recede. Only then were they ready for the next stage: cracking, peeling, chopping, leaching, the long transformation from toxic seed to real food. Modern people walk past acorns without a glance. Medieval families treated them with the kind of respect we reserve for paychecks. Because in the forest, knowledge wasn't a luxury. It was calories. It was endurance. It was inheritance. This wasn't foraging. It was a choreography of survival passed down through generations, memorized not by scholars, but by families who had no other choice. Once the acorns passed the forest tests and dried by the hearth, the real labor began. The kind of work that modern people underestimate because they've never had to earn calories one crack at a time. Medieval survival didn't start in the forest. It started on the floor of a dim hut, around a fire, with a pile of hard brown nuts, and a family determined to turn them into life. Cracking an acorn sounds simple until you've done it for an hour. Medieval peasants used the simplest tools imaginable: a flat stone and a hammerstone. No iron crackers, no machines, just rhythm and precision. Too light a hit, nothing happens. Too hard, and the nut meat turns into splinters mixed with shell grit. So each acorn required a tiny act of judgment, a miniature calculation performed hundreds of times. Angle, pressure, strike, peel. Over the course of the evening, the sound of tapping stones filled the home like a heartbeat. But cracking was just the beginning. Beneath the shell lay a second enemy, the papery brown skin called the testa, a thin membrane saturated with tannins. Leave it on, and the bitterness survives. Remove it, and you save yourself hours of extra leaching. Some acorns release the testa easily. Others cling stubbornly, requiring scraping with fingernails or a small knife. Each flake a reminder that medieval food preparation happened at the scale of millimeters. Imagine the scene. Children picking off testas with small fingers. Adults cracking shells with practiced movements. Elders sorting the pieces and tossing aside defects without a word. This was family labor as survival choreography. A domestic assembly line powered not by machinery, but by hunger, habit, and memory. In the Middle Ages, evenings weren't quiet. They were busy, purposeful, filled with repetitive motions that turned raw nature into edible hope. Once the shells and skins were removed, the nut meats had to be chopped. Not diced neatly, but pounded into gravel-sized pieces using the same hammerstone. This increased surface area, the ancient logic behind almost every cooking technique on Earth. The medieval mind understood chemistry through experience. Smaller pieces leach faster. Faster leaching means fewer days between raw bitterness and safe food. And this is where the truly fascinating part begins. The great leaching, the step that transforms a poisonous nut into nourishment. Tannins, the compounds that guard acorns, are water-soluble. Medieval people didn't need laboratories to know this. They learned it from time, from experimentation, from failure. Through trial, error, and desperation, they discovered that soaking or boiling acorns in repeated batches of water would draw out the toxins. Cold water meant patience, days of soaking, changing water morning and night. Hot water meant speed, but at a nutritional cost. Oils evaporated, starches cooked prematurely, and the final flour behaved differently. But their most ingenious discovery was the use of wood ash. In a world without chemical textbooks, they found a chemical shortcut. Ash from a hearth, especially hardwood ash, was alkaline. Mix it with boiling acorns, and a quiet reaction occurred. The alkaline solution broke tannins apart, neutralizing their bitterness and toxicity dramatically faster. What once took 6 water changes could take 3. For a family with nothing left in their grain stores, this wasn't minor. It was the difference between eating tonight or eating next week. Taste was their only metric. No pH strips, no thermometers. A peasant would rinse a small piece, chew slowly, and wait. If bitterness lingered, the work continued. If it tasted mild, nutty, almost like a boiled chestnut, then the transformation was complete. The poison was gone. The acorn had crossed the threshold into food. This was medieval chemistry, born not in monasteries or universities but in huts, in forests, in famine years when knowing the properties of a tree nut meant your children lived through the winter. Turning acorns edible required fire, water, stone, and patience. But above all, it required knowledge. Knowledge passed down through ancestors who learned these lessons the hard way. If shelling and chopping acorns was the physical grind of survival, then leaching, the removal of tannins, was the intellectual heart of medieval food science. This was the moment when knowledge mattered more than muscle. Every medieval family knew that acorns could feed you, but only if you first persuaded the poison to leave. And this persuasion was a slow, careful negotiation between water, heat, ash, and time. The chopped acorns, pale and innocent-looking, were anything but harmless. They were still saturated with tannins, the bitter polyphenols oak trees used to defend their seeds. In small doses, tannins create pleasant astringency. In the concentrations found inside raw acorns, they cause digestive distress, severe nutrient blockage, and eventually organ damage. A hungry medieval peasant might have been tempted to skip the process, but skipping it meant sickness. You didn't cheat tannins, you outsmarted them. And medieval peasants, contrary to stereotypes, were extraordinary empirical scientists. They learned to pull these toxins out using nothing but water. But the technique varied depending on time, weather, urgency, and personal taste. There were two major schools of practice, cold leaching and hot leaching. Each had strengths, weaknesses, and deep cultural memory behind it. Cold leaching was the slow, patient method, ideal in years when food supply was low but not yet desperate. Acorn pieces were submerged in cold water, often in woven baskets or clay pots, and the water was changed again and again throughout the day. This could take many days, even a full week. But the result was worth it. The natural oils stayed intact, the starches remained raw and powerful, and the final flour created a thick, rich porridge or gravy that medieval families relied on heavily. Cold, leached acorn flour was essentially a medieval thickener, a way to turn whatever scraps remained into something hearty. But famine rarely waits patiently, and neither could people. That's where hot leaching came in. Here, water was heated to a rolling boil, the acorn pieces were added, and tannins rushed out so fast they stained the water dark brown, first like tea, then like ink. Boil, strain, refill, repeat. Each batch became lighter. Each pour carried away more of the bitter compounds. Hot leaching stripped flavor quickly, but also stripped nutrients. Some of the oil escaped as steam, and the starches partially cooked, making the final flour less thickening and more gritty. You could eat sooner, but you paid for it later. Still, the most remarkable insight in this process wasn't cold or hot water, it was wood ash. In a world without laboratories, medieval people discovered a crude but effective form of alkaline hydrolysis. Ash, especially from hardwoods like oak, was alkaline. Add a scoop or two into boiling water, and something bordering on magic happened. The alkaline solution reacted with tannic acid, breaking the molecules apart into harmless compounds that dissolved rapidly. This wasn't a shortcut, it was a revelation. What normally required 5 or 6 cycles of water could be done in 2 or 3. For a starving family, those saved hours mattered. Ash was free. Ash was abundant. Ash was knowledge transformed into survival. But this technique came with a strict rule. Never mix cold and hot leaching. Medieval families learned the hard way that shifting temperatures caused the tannins to bind tightly to the acorn meat, locking them in permanently. Once that happened, the entire batch was ruined. You could boil it all day and still taste the bitterness of failure. This kind of hard-earned wisdom wasn't written in books. It was written in generations of mistakes, handed down like sacred law. The test for completion was deceptively simple. No instruments, no measurements, just taste. A small piece, rinsed clean, chewed slowly. Medieval survival relied on the human tongue as a chemical sensor. If bitterness pricked the sides of the mouth, the work continued. If the taste finally turned mild, nutty, earthy, almost like a boiled chestnut, then the acorns had crossed from poisonous to edible. There is something deeply human about this step. It reflects an era when survival required a partnership with nature rather than domination of it. The forest produced the nut. Fire unlocked its chemistry. Water coaxed out its bitterness. Ash accelerated the transformation. And a patient hand completed the ritual. Call it chemistry, call it intuition. But for medieval families, it was simply life. When the tannins were finally gone, the acorns were safe. But they were far from ready. Wet, pale, and flavorless, they were still only half transformed. To become food with real strength, they needed fire. And fire in the medieval world was more than heat. It was the final alchemist. The simplest method was also the oldest. Roasting in ashes. No pans, no utensils, just hot embers raked away from the flames. The leached acorn pieces were patted dry and laid directly onto the warm ash. They hissed softly on contact. A medieval cook would turn them with a stick, not rushing, watching the color shift from beige to golden brown. Slowly, the smell changed too. First, a faint earthy scent, then the unmistakable aroma of roasted nuts, something close to chestnut with a hint of smoke. In a famine, that smell alone could lift a family's spirits. But roasted acorns were only half the story. The real prize was acorn flour, the emergency flour that kept entire villages alive when wheat fields failed. Roasted pieces were crushed on a flat stone, then ground with a heavy river rock. This was the most punishing step of all. Hard, oily nuts resist being pulverized. It took minutes to make a tablespoon, hours to fill a bowl. Hands blistered. Arms shook. The grinding stone warmed under the pressure. Yet the result, a rich brown meal with shimmering oil droplets, was calories in their purest medieval form. Mixed with millet, barley, or even wild grass seeds, this flour became dense flat cakes cooked on hot stones. They weren't fluffy, they weren't soft, but they were solid, sustaining, and shockingly flavorful. Nutty, smoky, deeply earthy. A few of these heavy cakes could power a laborer through a day's work. And here lies the brutal math medieval families understood better than anyone. 5 hours of effort for a single modest meal. Today, that ratio feels absurd. But in a world where survival had no shortcuts, that exchange was not unfair. It was normal, it was necessary, and sometimes it was a miracle. For most of history, acorns lived in the shadows, a humble food of desperation, gathered by peasants, processed with blistered hands, eaten in years when nothing else would grow. But in one of the strangest twists of medieval cuisine, this poor food didn't stay poor. Over time, it climbed the social ladder, slipping quietly from peasant huts into noble kitchens, transformed not by necessity but by fashion. The shift began in the 15th century, when medical texts across Europe started praising the supposed health benefits of large, fresh acorns. Physicians claimed they strengthened the stomach, balanced humors, even improved vitality. And in the medieval world, where medical authority carried the prestige of science and mysticism combined. Anything recommended by a learned doctor quickly became culinary currency. What began as famine fare slowly gained a new aura, that of a functional food, a luxury with therapeutic charm. From there, the kitchen took over. Renaissance cooks, especially in Italy, began experimenting with acorns as if they were exotic imports. Recipes survived describing acorn purees, acorn dumplings, even acorn pies. But these weren't the acorns peasants boiled in dark pots. These were artificially ennobled acorns, as one text puts it, survival food elevated through extravagance. The process started the same way, leaching away tannins, but what followed was pure decadence. The acorn paste was mixed with fresh butter, rich cream, ricotta, grated aged cheese, sugar, cinnamon, pepper, and egg yolks. It was whipped, sieved, scented with rosewater, poured into pastry, and baked until delicate and golden. The final dish resembled a custard tart more than anything a starving peasant would recognize. It carried the soul of the forest, but wore the perfume of nobility. And yet, beneath the sugar and cream, one truth remained. The upper classes were feasting on a food that symbolized hardship for millions. It's a striking example of how medieval cuisine often inverted social meanings. Bread of barley, despised by elites, was everyday sustenance for the poor. Meanwhile, acorns, once the emblem of famine, became novelties on aristocratic tables, simply because someone added enough expensive ingredients to disguise their origins. This transformation reveals something essential about medieval society. Ingredients didn't determine status. Labor, scarcity, and symbolism did. When peasants served acorns, it was survival. When nobles served acorns, it was sophistication. The forest hadn't changed, the acorn hadn't changed, only the story around them had. When the final acorn is roasted, when the flour is ground, when the dense little cakes cool beside the fire, something happens that goes beyond flavor. You taste not just a nut, you taste the weight of centuries. Because acorns are more than food. They're a message from people who lived closer to the edge of survival than we can imagine, yet understood the natural world with an intimacy we've almost forgotten. To bite into a roasted acorn is to step into their world for a moment. A world where food didn't come from shelves but from seasons, where every meal required negotiation with nature. Water to draw out poison, stone to crush the grain, fire to make it edible. Where survival meant skill, patience, and relentless effort. Not luck, not convenience. If modern life is defined by abundance, medieval life was defined by work, hard, daily, unforgiving work. And somehow, people endured. Archaeology confirms what those families lived. Acorns weren't a novelty. They were infrastructure. 7,000-year-old pots still carry microscopic traces of acorn starch. Burned granaries from the Iron Age have been found filled not with wheat, but with carefully stored acorns. Medieval chronicles mention acorn bread in every major famine. Generations relied on these nuts the way we rely on supply chains, quietly, invisibly, constantly. The forest was their pantry, their safety net, their last guarantee when the world collapsed. And collapse it did. The Great Famine of 1315 ended after 7 brutal years, but the memory of it reshaped Europe. Stories of desperate foraging, of bitter nuts made edible, of families grinding flour by firelight. These memories became cultural shadows. They taught humility. They taught resourcefulness. They taught that survival is never owed, only earned. Today, roasting acorns isn't efficient. It isn't rational. It doesn't make economic sense in a world of supermarkets. But that's exactly why it matters. It reminds us that our comfort is recent, fragile, and built on the backs of ancestors who outwitted famine with nothing but fire, stone, and knowledge. It tells us that history isn't just written in books. It lies under our feet in forests full of forgotten wisdom. In the end, when you taste a roasted acorn, you're tasting resilience. You're tasting the quiet brilliance of people who refused to die. You're tasting a skill that carried humanity through crisis after crisis. And the truth is simple. History tastes better than we remember.